If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be standing here, with sand between my toes and the taste of salt on my lips, I would have told them they were crazy, utterly and completely mad. Back then, my world was small. It was safe. It was confined to a third-floor apartment in a Boston brownstone, a world measured in worn floorboards and the scent of old books. But that was before. Now, I watched the sun rise over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of pale pink and soft orange. The waves whisper secrets as they roll onto the shore, leaving behind gifts of foam and treasure. I reach into my pocket and my fingers close around a piece of sea glass. It's a pale blue, worn smooth by the relentless churn of the ocean. It was once part of something else, a bottle, maybe a jar, something useful. Then it was broken, discarded, tossed into the deep. For years, it was battered by rocks and sand, its sharp edges worn away until it became this. Something new. Something beautiful in its own way. I close my hand around it, the glass cool against my palm. Sometimes, losing everything you think you are is the only way to find out who you're meant to be. I wasn't brave. I wasn't looking for an adventure. I was just a woman who had her past stolen from her. And that theft, as painful as it was, became my map to this exact spot, to this exact moment of peace. It all started a year ago, on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in May. The air in Boston had that specific spring scent, a mix of damp earth and blooming magnolia trees. My morning routine was as predictable as the sunrise. I'd wake up, make a cup of tea, and read a chapter of whatever book I was working through. Then, I'd take my canvas tote bag and walk the 4 blocks to Rossi's bakery. Mr. Rossi, with his flour-dusted apron and booming laugh, always had a small loaf of olive bread waiting for me. We'd chat for a few minutes about the weather, or the Red Sox, or his daughter's latest college exams. It was a simple ritual, but it was mine. It was one of the few things left in my life that hadn't changed since Richard passed away. That morning, the sun was warm on my face as I walked home. I remember thinking how lovely it all was. The familiar brick buildings, the iron railings, the cheerful sound of kids playing in the park across the street. I felt a sense of contentment, a quiet hum of normalcy that had taken me years to rebuild. I turned the corner onto my street and stopped. There was a truck parked in front of my building. A big, white moving truck. Its back doors were wide open, like a gaping mouth, and 2 men in gray uniforms were carrying something down my front steps. It was a lamp. My lamp. The one with the hand-painted ceramic base that Richard and I bought on our honeymoon in Italy. My heart gave a painful thud against my ribs. There must be a mistake. They must have the wrong address. I hurried my steps, the little loaf of bread suddenly feeling like a rock in my bag. "Excuse me," I said, my voice thin and reedy. "I think you're at the wrong building." One of the men, broad-shouldered and sweating, grunted. "Vance apartment? 3rd floor?" "Yes. But..." Before I could finish, the second man emerged, and my breath caught in my throat. He was carrying Richard's armchair, the big, worn leather one with the permanent indent where his head used to rest. The arms were shiny and smooth from years of his hands resting on them while he read the evening paper. I could almost see him sitting there, looking up over his spectacles to smile at me. "No," I whispered. The word was a puff of air, lost in the city noise. "Not Richard's chair." I pushed past them, stumbling up the 3 flights of stairs I had climbed every day for 40 years. My apartment door was propped open, and standing in the middle of my living room, directing the movers with a cheerful wave of her hand, was my daughter, Jessica. She was dressed in a sharp business suit, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail. She was on her phone, probably closing some multi-million-dollar deal. When she saw me, her face broke into a brilliant, wide smile. "Mom! Perfect timing. What do you think?" She gestured around the room, but there was nothing to look at. The room was almost empty. The bookshelves Richard had built by hand were gone. The small, scarred coffee table where Jessica had taken her first steps was gone. The Persian rug we'd saved for a year to buy was gone. All that remained were ghosts' pale rectangles on the walls where pictures used to hang. Clean squares on the floor where furniture used to sit. Jess? What is this? What's happening? My voice trembled. It's a surprise, she announced, clicking off her phone and slipping it into her pocket. I've been planning it for weeks. You are getting a complete refresh. A whole new start. My mind couldn't process the words. A refresh? A new start? I looked around the hollowed-out space that had been my home. The sanctuary that held every memory I cherished. The air smelled of dust and emptiness. You sold my things? I asked, the question feeling absurd on my tongue. Sold is such a harsh word, she said lightly, walking over to give me a one-armed hug. I hired a fantastic estate clearing company. They took everything. And the best part is, all new furniture is being delivered tomorrow. Italian leather sofa. A minimalist glass coffee table. Smart lighting. It's going to be so modern and clean. No more clutter. No more dust. Clutter. Dust. She was talking about my life. About the little porcelain bird Richard gave me for our 10th anniversary. About the collection of snow globes from every state we'd visited together. About the framed, faded drawing Jessica had made for me in kindergarten that read, "To the best mom." But, why? I finally managed to get out. My throat was tight with unshed tears. Jessica's smile faltered slightly. She looked at me with an expression of strained patience. The one she used when explaining complicated financial reports to clients who just didn't get it. Mom, we've talked about this. You've been rattling around in this museum for years. It's not healthy. It's what happened to Grandma after Grandpa died. She just faded away amongst all her old things. I can't let that happen to you. I want you to look forward, not backward. She thought she was helping. I could see it in her eyes. That earnest, misguided certainty. She loved me. I knew she did. But her love felt like a bulldozer, paving over my entire world without ever asking if I wanted a new road. The movers came back in. Ma'am, we're ready for the dining set now. My eyes flew to the corner where our old oak table stood. It was the heart of our home. It was where we'd celebrated birthdays and Thanksgivings. It bore the marks of our history, a small burn from a forgotten candle, a deep scratch from Jessica's ice skate one winter, the faint water ring from Richard's favorite mug. No, I said, my voice suddenly firm. You can't take that. I walked over and placed my hands flat on the table's surface, as if I could physically hold it down. The wood was cool and solid beneath my palms. Jessica sighed. A long, exasperated sound. Mom, please don't make this difficult. The new one is beautiful. It's made of reclaimed Scandinavian pine. It's very chic. I don't want chic, I said, my voice rising. I want my table. I want my life back. The movers looked on awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot. Jessica's face hardened. The deal is done. Everything is going. It's for your own good. For your own good. The four most terrifying words in the English language. They are the words used to justify a violation. I felt a cold, sharp anger slice through my grief. An anger I hadn't felt in years. How dare she? How dare she walk into my home, my life, and decide what was good for me? How dare she erase my husband? Erase our shared history. With a credit card and a decorator's consultation? I didn't say another word. I stood there, stiff and silent, as they dismantled the table. I watched as they carried away the chairs where my family had sat. I watched as they rolled up the rug that had cushioned my daughter's falls. I watched them carry out the last 40 years of my life, piece by piece, and load it into a truck to be driven away forever. When they were done, Jessica turned to me, her bright smile back in place, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. See? It's already so much brighter in here. Once the new things arrive, you'll feel like a new woman. I have to run to a meeting, but I'll call you tonight to see how you're settling in. The sofa company is leaving one of the old ones until tomorrow, so you'll have a place to sit. She kissed my cheek. It felt like the brush of a stranger. Then she was gone, her heels clicking purposefully down the stairs, leaving me alone in the echoing silence of my own life. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the bare windows, painting rectangles of light on the hardwood floors where our life used to be. The single piece of furniture left was a small, faded love seat, pushed against a naked wall. It looked lost and pathetic. I knew how it felt. I walked through the empty rooms. My footsteps echoed unnaturally. I ran my hand along a wall, feeling the absence of a framed photograph. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, where the scent of Richard's coffee and my baking used to linger. Now, it just smelled of lemon-scented cleaner. It was sterile, anesthetized, erased. I sank onto the love seat, the old springs groaning in protest. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was loud. It screamed with everything that was missing. I was 64 years old, and I was a ghost in my own home. My daughter, in her frantic effort to keep me from fading away, had made me invisible. I didn't cry. The shock was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hollow ache in the center of my chest. For hours, I just sat there, watching the light change as the sun went down. The city lights began to twinkle outside, but inside, it was just darkness and shadows. My home was gone. My past had been packed up and hauled away. My future was a catalog of Scandinavian furniture I didn't want. Jessica thought she was giving me a new start, but what she had really done was untether me. She had cut the ropes that tied me to this place, to this life. She just didn't realize that without those ropes, I was free to drift away. Sometime late that night, a resolve began to form in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't a grand plan. It was just a small, hard kernel of defiance. If my past was gone, then I was no longer obligated to live in it. If my present was an empty room, I could choose to fill it with whatever I wanted. I got up and walked into the kitchen. My purse was on the counter, one of the few things left untouched. I pulled out a pen and a crumpled grocery receipt from the bottom of the bag. I sat back down on the lonely love seat, smoothed the paper on my knee, and clicked the pen. The empty space around me seemed to hold its breath. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like an absence. It felt like a blank page. At the top of the receipt, above the list of milk, eggs, and bread, I wrote a heading. My hand was steady. The words looked foreign and powerful in the dim light. Things I can still do for myself at 64. The list started slowly. The first line was a simple, defiant act. 1. Make my own tea in the morning. Seemed trivial. But after a day of having every decision made for me, the act of choosing Earl Grey over English breakfast felt like a revolution. I wrote it down. The blue ink a stark line on the back of the receipt. My mind, so used to the familiar grooves of my old life, struggled to come up with the next item. What could I do? For so long, my identity had been wrapped up in the roles I played. Richard's wife, Jessica's mother, caretaker of our home and its memories. Without those, who was Eleanor Vance? I looked out the window at the dark silhouette of the city skyline. I had lived in Boston my whole life. Born here, married here, raised my child here. I had watched Richard's casket being lowered into the cold Massachusetts earth here. The city was woven into the fabric of my being, its streets as familiar as the lines on my own hands. But suddenly, felt like a cage. A beautiful, familiar cage. But a cage nonetheless. I thought of the ocean. Richard and I used to drive out to Cape Cod every summer. I remembered the feeling of standing at the edge of the water, the vast, endless blue stretching out to the horizon. The thought was a small spark in the suffocating darkness of the empty apartment. 2. Live somewhere I can see the ocean every day. The moment I wrote it down, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just a wish. It was a possibility. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. To leave? To leave Boston? To leave everything I had ever known? But what was left to know? A collection of modern furniture I didn't choose? A daughter who saw me as a problem to be managed? My phone buzzed on the floor beside me. It was Jessica. I ignored it. I wasn't ready to hear her cheerful, oblivious voice. I wasn't ready to perform gratitude for the destruction of my world. The phone buzzed again, then fell silent. A moment later, a text message notification lit up the screen. Mom, are you okay? Just checking in. Hope you're not too overwhelmed. Tomorrow will be so exciting. Exciting. She thought this was exciting. I felt another surge of that cold anger. Fueled me. My pen moved again. Faster this time. 3. Learn something completely new. 4. Make a friend who doesn't know my history. 5. Eat dinner whenever I want, even if it's just crackers and cheese at 10 p.m. The list grew. Each item was a small rebellion. Walk barefoot on the grass. Read a book from cover to cover in one day without feeling guilty. Adopt a cat. I didn't know if I would do any of these things, but the act of writing them down was a declaration of independence. I was claiming ownership of my own future. A future Jessica couldn't curate or control. The last thing I wrote, just before my pen ran out of ink, was find out who I am now. I fell asleep on the love seat, the crumpled receipt clutched in my hand. I dreamed of waves and seagulls, of a wide-open sky. The next morning, the doorbell rang, sharp and intrusive. It was the delivery men with the new sofa. I let them in and stood by the wall, watching them expertly maneuver a massive, white leather sectional into the room. It was stark and cold, an alien presence in the space. It looked like it belonged in a magazine, not a home. Where do you want it, ma'am? The lead man asked. I looked at the empty space, then at the sofa. I felt nothing. No attachment. No excitement. It wasn't mine. None of this was mine anymore. Just leave it there, I said, pointing to the center of the room. And please, take this one with you. I gestured to the old love seat. They hauled it away, and with it, the last remnant of my old life. After they left, I made my Tyrol gray, just as my list had instructed, and sat down on the edge of the enormous white sofa. It was stiff and uncomfortable. I pulled out my laptop, an old model that Jessica was always trying to get me to replace. I opened a web browser and, with trembling fingers, typed the words from my list into the search bar. Small coastal towns to live in. The search results were a blur of names and places. Maine, Oregon, Florida. Then my eyes landed on a name that sounded like poetry. Seaglass Point, North Carolina. The article described it as a quiet, artsy community on the Outer Banks, known for its pristine beaches and friendly locals. There were pictures of charming, weathered cottages with wide porches, miles of sandy shoreline, and a small, inviting town center. It looked like another world. A world where the pace was slower, where the air was clean, where life was measured by the tides. On a whim, I clicked on a link for local rentals. The very first listing was for a place called the Sandpiper Cottage. It was a small, one-bedroom house, painted a cheerful shade of seafoam green, with white trim and a little porch. It was just a block from the beach. The description said it was available for a 6-month lease, fully furnished. The rent was surprisingly affordable, well within the budget I could manage with my widow's pension and the small savings account Richard had left me. My heart was beating so fast it felt like a trapped bird in my chest. This was insane. I was Eleanor Vance. I was a 64-year-old woman who had never lived anywhere but Boston. I didn't do impulsive things. My life was a series of carefully considered, responsible decisions. But what was I being responsible for now? An empty apartment? A daughter who treated me like a child? I looked at the list still clutched in my hand. Live somewhere I can see the ocean every day. Before I could second-guess myself, before logic and fear could rush in and shut the door on this crazy impulse, I clicked the Inquire Now button. I filled out the form with my name and email address. In the message box, I wrote, "I am a quiet, retired woman looking for a peaceful change. I can move in as soon as possible." I hit send. The silence that followed was deafening. My own audacity stunned me. What had I just done? For a moment, panic seized me. I should have asked Jessica. I should have made a pros and cons list. I should have taken weeks, months, to think about it. Then, the anger returned. No, this was my decision. This was the first real decision I had made for myself, and only myself, in a very long time. An hour later, an email pinged in my inbox. It was from the rental agent, a woman named Carol. She said the owner was delighted to have a long-term tenant, and that if I could wire the deposit and first month's rent, the cottage was mine. I spent the next 2 hours at the bank, arranging the wire transfer. The young teller was bubbly and efficient. "Going on a nice vacation?" she asked as she processed the paperwork. "Something like that," I replied, a small, secret smile playing on my lips. A new start. When I returned to the apartment, felt even more alien than before. It was no longer my home. It was just a stopover, a temporary holding place before my real life began. I packed a single large suitcase with clothes, toiletries, and the few personal items Jessica's purge had missed me wedding ring, which I wore on a chain around my neck. A small, framed photo of Richard I kept in my bedside table, and my collection of classic novels. The last thing I did was write a letter to Jessica. I sat at the new, gleaming kitchen counter that felt cold and foreign to the touch. I took a piece of plain paper and wrote, "Dearest Jessica, by the time you read this, I will be gone. Please don't be angry. You said you wanted me to have a new start, and I've decided to take you up on that offer. Just not in the way you intended. I know you love me, and I know you did what you did because you were scared. You were scared I would end up like Grandma. But sweetheart, I am not my mother, and I am not just a collection of old furniture. I am a person, and I need to find out who that person is now. I have rented a small cottage by the sea. I need some time and space to figure things out on my own. I will call you when I am settled. Please don't try to find me before then. This is something I have to do for myself. I love you more than words can say. But for the first time in a long time, I am choosing to love myself, too. All my love. Mom." I folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote Jessica on the front. I left it propped up against a ridiculously oversized white vase in the center of the new dining table. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, I called a car service. I walked out of the apartment building without a backward glance. I didn't want to see the empty rooms again. I didn't want to sit on the cold, white sofa. My home wasn't there anymore. My home was a memory. And maybe, just maybe, it was also a promise waiting for me hundreds of miles down the coast. As the car pulled away from the curb, I looked at the familiar brownstone for the last time. 40 years. It was a lifetime. I had walked in as a young bride and was now walking out as a widow, a mother, and something else I couldn't yet name. A runaway. Perhaps. An adventurer. A fool. I didn't know which one I was. But as the car merged onto the highway and the Boston skyline began to shrink in the rearview mirror, I didn't feel sadness. I didn't feel fear. I felt a quiet, thrilling sense of possibility. The road ahead was unknown, a blank map waiting to be filled in. For the first time in a very long time, I was the one holding the pen. The drive south was a long, hypnotic blur of asphalt and green highway signs. I drove for 2 days, stopping only for gas, cheap coffee, and a restless night in a sterile motel somewhere in Virginia. The motel room was beige and anonymous, the kind of place that could be anywhere and nowhere at all. As I lay in the lumpy bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, a wave of panic washed over me. What was I doing? I was 64 years old, running away from home like a rebellious teenager. I had no plan, no friends waiting for me, nothing but a 6-month lease and a crazy list written on a grocery receipt. For a moment, I almost turned back. I could call Jessica, apologize for the drama, and learn to live with the white leather sofa. I could pretend to be the person she wanted me to be, a modern, forward-looking woman who didn't need the past. But then I thought of Richard's armchair being carried out the door. I thought of the ghost shapes on the walls where our life had hung. And the anger, cold and clear, returned. It wasn't just about the furniture. It was about being seen. And in Boston, I had become invisible. I closed my eyes and pictured the ocean. I kept driving south. I crossed the bridge into the Outer Banks on the third morning. The change in the air was immediate. The thick city haze gave way to a bright, clean light that seemed to shimmer. The air that rushed through my open window was salty and humid, tinged with the scent of pine and wild roses. On either side of the narrow road, tall seagrass swayed in the breeze. Seaglass Point wasn't hard to find. It was a small town, announced by a single, weather-beaten wooden sign with a carving of a sandpiper on it. The main street was lined with pastel-colored cottages, art galleries with whimsical names, and small shops with wide, welcoming porches. Live oak trees, draped in Spanish moss, leaned over the road, creating a canopy of dappled shade. It was slower here, quieter. People on bicycles waved as I drove past. The Sandpiper cottage was exactly as it looked in the pictures. It was tucked away on a quiet side street, painted a soft seafoam green with a white porch swing moving gently in the breeze. A riot of pink and red impatiens spilled out of the window boxes. It looked happy. Parked the car, my hands shaking slightly as I turned off the ignition. This was it. I got out. And the sound that greeted me wasn't the distant sirens of Boston, but the rhythmic, soothing crash of waves. The ocean was close. I could feel it. The key was under a clay pot shaped like a frog, just as the agent, Carol, had said it would be. I let myself in. The cottage was small, but airy and filled with light. The furniture was simple and comfortably a blue and white striped sofa, a sturdy wooden dining table, a cozy-looking bed with a handmade quilt. It was a blank canvas. It wasn't filled with my memories, but it wasn't filled with Jessica's ambitions either. It was just a space. My space. I walked through the small house, running my hand along the cool plaster walls. In the bedroom, a large window looked out onto a small, sandy backyard. And beyond the dunes, I could see it. A sliver of deep, endless blue. The Atlantic Ocean. I dropped my purse on the floor and sank onto the bed, the reality of it all finally hitting me. I had done it. Item number 2 on my list. Live somewhere I can see the ocean every day. A tear slipped down my cheek. But it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of profound, terrifying relief. The first few days were a strange mix of freedom and paralyzing loneliness. I unpacked my suitcase, placing the photo of Richard on the bedside table. I arranged my books on the small shelf in the living room. I went to the local grocery store and bought milk, eggs, and bread, the same items that had been on the fateful receipt. But after those small tasks were done, the hours stretched before me, empty and unstructured. Back in Boston, my days had a rhythm. Cleaning the apartment, tending to my small window box garden, my walk to the bakery, my weekly call with Jessica. Here, there was nothing. No one expecting me. No tasks demanding my attention. The silence in the cottage was immense. It was a living thing, breathing with the sigh of the ocean and the creak of the old floorboards. On the third morning, I couldn't bear the quiet anymore. I put on my sneakers, grabbed the cottage key, and walked in the direction of the waves. A short, Sandy path at the end of the street led me over a dune, and then the world opened up. The beach was vast and empty, the sand pale and soft under my feet. The ocean was 100 different shades of blue and green, stretching to a horizon that seemed to go on forever. Gulls wheeled and cried overhead. I walked for a long time, the wind whipping my hair around my face. I felt small, insignificant against the sheer scale of it all. But it wasn't a bad feeling. It was humbling. It put my own small griefs into perspective. As I walked, my eyes scanned the line where the waves met the sand. And then I saw it. A tiny glint of color amongst the shells and seaweed. I bent down and picked it up. It was a small, smooth piece of green glass, its edges worn away by the sea. A piece of sea glass. I closed my fingers around its perfect, smooth shape. Felt like a sign. A welcome. I spent the rest of the morning walking, my pockets slowly filling with tiny treasuries, a milky white piece of glass, a deep cobalt blue, a common brown one from an old beer bottle. Each one felt like a promise, a reminder that broken things could be made beautiful again. On my way back, I decided to explore the town center. I wandered past a shop selling handmade soaps, a small cafe with outdoor seating, and a gallery filled with bright, abstract paintings of the ocean. And then I saw a sign that made my heart give a little leap of recognition. The Book Nook. It was a charming little shop, its blue door propped open. A sign in the window read, "A book is a dream that you hold in your hands." I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The air smelled of old paper and wood polish, a scent that was instantly comforting. Books were everywhere, piled on tables, crammed into shelves that reached the ceiling. It was the complete opposite of Jessica's minimalist vision. It was cluttered and chaotic and wonderful. A man was sitting on a stool behind the counter, reading. He looked up as the bell over the door chimed. He was about my age, maybe a little older, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a head of thick, silver hair. "Good morning," he said, his voice quiet and calm. "Can I help you find anything?" "Oh, no, thank you," I said, feeling suddenly shy. "I'm just looking." "Please, take your time." He gave me a small, gentle smile and went back to his book, leaving me to my exploration. I ran my fingers along the spines of the books, the titles of familiar comfort. Dickens, Austen, Hemingway. They felt like old friends. After years of feeling like a museum curator for my own life, here I was in a place where history was cherished and preserved on every shelf. I eventually picked out a collection of Mary Oliver's poems. I had always loved her work, her quiet observations of the natural world. It seemed fitting for this new place. I took the book to the counter. The man took it from me, his fingers brushing mine for a fleeting second. "An excellent choice," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled again. She knew how to pay attention. "Yes, she did," I agreed. He rang up the purchase. "I don't believe I've seen you in here before. Are you visiting?" I just moved here," I said. The words felt strange to say out loud, but also thrilling. I wasn't a visitor. I belonged here, at least for now. "Well then, welcome to Seaglass Point," he said warmly. "I'm Arthur Pendleton. This is my shop." "Eleanor Vance. It's nice to meet you." "Eleanor," he repeated, as if trying the name out. "I hope you come to love this place as much as I do." "I think I already am," I said, surprising myself with my own sincerity. I left the shop with the book tucked under my arm, a small warmth spreading through my chest. It was just a brief conversation, a simple transaction, but it was the first real connection I had made in my new life. It was a start. That night, I didn't feel lonely. I sat on the porch swing, the book of poems in my lap, and watched the stars appear in the dark, unpolluted sky. The ocean whispered in the distance. The air was soft and warm. I read a poem about wild geese, about finding your place in the family of things. For the first time since I saw that moving truck, I felt a flicker of something I had thought was lost for good. Hope. It was fragile, like a piece of sea glass just washed ashore. But it was there. And it was mine. My days in Seaglass Point began to take on a new rhythm, one dictated by the tides and the sun rather than the ticking clock on a kitchen wall. Each morning started with a walk on the beach. It became a kind of meditation. I'd leave my phone in the cottage and just walk, focusing on the feeling of the wet sand under my feet, the sound of the gulls, the vastness of the sky. My sea glass collection grew, each piece a small jewel I'd turn over in my palm, wondering about its journey. I fell into a comfortable routine with Arthur at the book nook. I'd stop in every few days, first just to buy a book, but soon it became an excuse to talk. He was a gentle soul, a good listener with a quiet sense of humor. He never pried, but he had a way of asking questions that made me want to share things. I learned that he, too, was a widower. His wife, Clara, had been a painter and had passed away 5 years prior. The bookstore had been their shared dream. Now, it was his sanctuary, his connection to her. She would have loved your eye for poetry. He told me one afternoon as I was browsing the shelves. Richard, my husband, was the reader in our family. I admitted. He loved history. Big, thick books about wars and presidents. I mostly read novels. A good story is a good story, no matter the subject, Arthur said with a smile. It's a way of living 1,000 lives. I thought about that. For so long, I had only been living one life, and a quiet one at that. Maybe he was right. My other source of connection came from an unexpected place. My next-door neighbor was a woman named Maria Flores. She was about 15 years my junior, with a wild mane of dark curly hair, paint-splattered overalls, and a laugh that could be heard from across the street. Her yard was a chaotic explosion of flowers, wind chimes, and strange, wonderful sculptures made of driftwood and metal. She introduced herself by knocking on my door one morning, holding a plate of still-warm blueberry muffins. "You're the new tenant," she boomed, her voice full of energy. "I'm Maria. Welcome to the neighborhood. I saw you walking on the beach every morning. You've got the right idea. The ocean cures everything." I was taken aback by her directness, her sheer force of personality. "I'm Eleanor," I said, accepting the plate. "Thank you. These smell wonderful." "Baking is my stress relief," she said, waving a hand dismissively. "That and throwing mud." "Throwing mud?" I asked, confused. "I'm a potter," she explained, grinning. "I have a studio in my backyard. You should come see it sometime. I'll even let you get your hands dirty." Maria was the opposite of me in every way. She was loud where I was quiet, spontaneous where I was deliberate. But there was a warmth to her that was irresistible. A few days later, I took her up on her offer. Her studio was a wonderfully messy shed behind her house, smelling of damp clay and incense. Shelves were lined with mugs, bowls, and vases in various stages of completion. A large potter's wheel sat in the center of the room. "Go on," she urged, pointing to a lump of gray clay. "Give it a try." Hesitantly, I sat at the wheel. Maria showed me how to center the clay, how to use my hands to coax it upwards, to shape it. It was much harder than it looked. My first attempt was a wobbly, lopsided disaster that collapsed into a sad lump. I felt a flush of embarrassment. Maria just laughed. "Perfect. The first failure is the most important one. It means you're not afraid to get it wrong. Try again." And so I did. I spent the rest of the afternoon in her studio, my hands covered in clay, my mind completely focused on the spinning wheel in front of me. I forgot about Boston. I forgot about Jessica. I forgot about the empty apartment. For the first time, I was completely and utterly in the present moment. By the end of the day, I had managed to create a small, slightly crooked bowl. It was far from perfect, but I had made it. With my own 2 hands, I had created something new. 3. Learned something completely new. I had checked another item off my list. The small bowl sat on my kitchen counter. Proud, tangible symbol of my new life. I hadn't spoken to Jessica since leaving Boston. I knew she must have found the letter. I imagined her anger, her confusion, probably her panic. Part of me felt a deep pang of guilt, but a stronger part of me knew I had needed this silence. I needed to hear my own voice before I could listen to hers again. After 3 weeks in Seaglass Point, I finally felt ready. I sat on my porch swing one evening, the phone feeling heavy in my hand, and dialed her number. She answered on the first ring. Mom? Oh my God. Mom. Where are you? Are you okay? Her voice was a torrent of frantic energy. I'm fine. Jessica. I'm safe. Safe? Where are you? I was about to file a missing persons report. Called all your friends. No one had heard from you. I thought. I don't know what I thought. I told you in my letter. I needed some space. Space? Her voice rose with incredulity. You disappeared. You left a cryptic note and vanished. I came back to the apartment and found that letter and, Mom, what were you thinking? I took a deep breath, clutching the phone tightly. I would not be pulled back into the old dynamic. I would not become the apologetic, timid mother. I was thinking that I am a grown woman, Jessica, and I don't need your permission to live my own life. The words came out stronger than I expected. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. I had never spoken to her like that before. I was just trying to help, she finally said, her voice smaller now. I know you were, I said, softening my tone slightly. But your help felt like an erasure. You threw away my life. Jess. You threw away Dad. That's not fair. I was trying to give you a future. I already had a past. And it was a good one. It deserved to be respected. Not cleared out by an estate company. I could hear the emotion thickening my voice. But I pushed on. I'm in a little town on the coast. I've rented a cottage. I'm okay. I'm more than okay. A cottage? By yourself? Mom? That's not safe. You don't know anyone. You should come home. The new furniture is all set up. It looks beautiful. The mention of the furniture made my stomach clench. She still didn't get it. I'm not coming home. Jessica. This is my home now. At least for a while. For how long? What's your plan? She demanded, slipping back into her role as the project manager of my life. I don't have a plan, I said, and the words were liberating. My plan is to wake up every morning and see what the day brings. My plan is to learn how to make a decent bowl on a potter's wheel. My plan is to read books and walk on the beach. That's my plan. I could practically hear her running a hand through her hair in frustration. Mom, this is crazy. You're having some kind of breakdown. No, Jessica, I said, my voice calm and clear. This is the opposite of a breakdown. This is a breakthrough. We talked for a few more minutes, the conversation circling the same drain of her disbelief and my quiet resolve. She begged for my address, but I wouldn't give it to her. Not yet. I promised to call her every week. And with that, we hung up. I felt exhausted, but also strangely triumphant. I had held my ground. I had defended my new life. It was a wobbly, uncertain life, but it was mine. To make some extra money and, more importantly, to give my days more structure. I took a bold step. I walked into the book nook a few days later and asked Arthur if he needed any part-time help. He looked up from a stack of old books he was cataloging, a surprised but pleased expression on his face. Well, I hadn't really thought about it, he admitted. It's always just been me. I'd only want a few hours a day, I said quickly. Just to shelve books, help customers, dust a little. I'm a hard worker, and I love books. He studied my face for a long moment, his kind eyes thoughtful. You know, he said slowly, it would be nice to have the company. And just like that, I had a job. It barely paid more than minimum wage. But it wasn't about the money. It was about purpose. It was about being a part of something. About having a place to go every day. It was about checking another item off a list I no longer needed to carry in my pocket. Because I was starting to live it. Working alongside Arthur was as comfortable as sinking into a well-loved armchair. We developed an easy rhythm, punctuated by long, comfortable silences and quiet conversations about books, life, and the strange turns a path can take. The book nook became my second home, a place where I felt not just visible, but valued. Eleanor Vance, the woman who knew exactly where to find the first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird. Eleanor Vance, the woman who could recommend the perfect mystery novel to a tourist. I was building a new identity, one shelf at a time. Life in Seaglass Point settled into a gentle, pleasing rhythm. The summer sun warmed the sand, and my skin took on a healthy glow I hadn't seen in years. My mornings were for the beach, my afternoons for the bookstore, and my evenings were spent on my porch, listening to the crickets and the distant ocean. The quiet that had once felt so suffocating now felt peaceful, filled not with absence but with possibility. My weekly calls with Jessica were tense but predictable. She'd start each conversation with a hopeful, "So, are you ready to come home yet?" And I would gently but firmly tell her no. I'd tell her about my job at the bookstore, about Maria's pottery studio, about a particularly beautiful sunset I had seen. I was painting a picture of a life for her, a life she couldn't seem to comprehend. It all sounds nice, Mom. Quaint, she'd say. The word quaint laced with a faint condescension. But it's not a long-term solution. What about your doctors in Boston? Your friends? I can find a new doctor, Jessica. And I'm making new friends. 4. Make a friend who doesn't know my history. I thought of Arthur and Maria. They didn't know the Eleanor who had arranged her life around a man and a child. They only knew the Eleanor who was here now, the quiet woman who loved poetry, the surprisingly determined novice potter. It was refreshing to be seen not as a collection of past roles, but simply as myself. One sweltering afternoon in July, Arthur and I were in the back room of the bookstore, sorting through a box of donated books. The air was thick with the dusty smell of old paper. "Here's a treasure," he said, pulling out a faded, leather-bound copy of Moby Dick. He handled it with a reverence that touched me. You can tell a lot about a person by the books they keep. Or the ones they give away, I added quietly. He looked at me, his gaze gentle. "You're still sad about what you lost, aren't you?" It was the first time he had directly referenced the vague story I told him about my downsizing in Boston. I'd never given him the full, messy details of Jessica's intervention. I nodded, a familiar ache tightening my chest. Sometimes, it's not the things themselves. Not really. It's the stories. Every scratch on a table, every chip on a cup. They were like paragraphs in the story of my life. And one day, the book was just gone. A story can be rewritten, he said softly, or a new one can be started. He placed the old book carefully on a shelf. Clara, my wife, she used to say that memories aren't in the objects. They're in us. The objects are just anchors. Sometimes, you have to pull up the anchor to see where the current will take you. His words settled in my heart. A profound and simple truth. He was right. I had been so focused on the lost anchors that I hadn't trusted myself to remember the voyage. The current of my new life was pulling me in a direction I never expected. My friendship with Arthur deepened. We started having lunch together at the small cafe next to the bookstore. We talked about everything and nothing: our late spouses, our children, our dreams for the future. I learned about his passion for birdwatching and his failed attempts at baking sourdough bread. He learned about my love for gardening and my secret belief that I could have been a librarian in another life. With him, I felt a sense of ease, of being completely understood, that I hadn't felt since Richard was alive. It wasn't the same. Of course, the love I had for Richard was a deep, foundational part of who I was. This was different. It was a quieter, gentler connection, like two ships that had weathered their own storms finding safe harbor next to each other. Maria, in her own boisterous way, was also pulling me out of my shell. She insisted I join her for the town's weekly Friday night potluck in the community park. Everyone goes. It's how we keep up with the gossip, she said, winking. And Mrs. Higgins makes a lemon meringue pie that will change your life. You have to come. The thought of walking into a crowd of strangers was terrifying. But the thought of disappointing Maria was, somehow, worse. So I went, armed with a pasta salad and a crippling sense of social anxiety. It was nothing like the stiff, formal dinner parties Jessica sometimes dragged me to in Boston. This was a chaotic, joyful gathering of people in shorts and flip-flops, sitting on picnic blankets and lawn chairs. Kids chased fireflies while their parents chatted and laughed. Maria immediately took me under her wing, introducing me to a whirlwind of faces and names. There was the local fisherman who told terrible jokes, the young couple who ran the surf shop, the retired schoolteacher who organized a beach cleanup every month. They were all so welcoming. They asked where I was from, but they were more interested in what I thought of Seaglass Point. They didn't care about my past. They just accepted me as I was. The new lady in the Sandpiper cottage. I even had a slice of Mrs. Higgins' lemon meringue pie. It was, as promised, life-changing. I walked home that night with a full stomach and a fuller heart, the sound of laughter still echoing in my ears. I was building a community. I was laying down new roots. One conversation, one slice of pie at a time. I was so wrapped up in my new world that when the black luxury sedan with Massachusetts plates pulled up in front of my cottage one Saturday morning, my first thought was that someone was lost. Then the driver's side door opened, and Jessica stepped out. My heart plummeted into my stomach. She looked completely out of place. A sharp-edged figure in tailored slacks and a silk blouse against the backdrop of my sleepy, sandy street. She wore sunglasses I was sure cost more than my first month's rent. She took them off and surveyed the cottage, her expression a mixture of disbelief and disapproval. So this is it, she said, her voice tight. This is your cottage. I stood on my porch, frozen. I hadn't given her my address. She must have hired someone to find me. The thought sent a chill down my spine. It was another violation. Another boundary crossed. Jessica, I said, my voice barely a whisper. What are you doing here? What am I doing here? She let out a short, incredulous laugh. I'm here to bring my mother home. Of course. This little experiment of yours has gone on long enough. She marched up the porch steps, her heels sinking slightly into the soft wood. She looked past me, into the open door of the cottage. My God, it's even smaller than I imagined. Mom, how are you living like this? It's practically a shack. The anger that had been simmering for months boiled over. This shack is my home, I said, my voice shaking with fury. And you were not invited. Oh, don't be so dramatic, she said, brushing past me into the living room. She ran a finger along the wooden coffee table, checking for dust. I was worried sick. You can't just run off and live in some backwater town without telling anyone where you are. It's irresponsible. What's irresponsible is selling your mother's entire life without her permission. I shot back, following her inside. The small, peaceful space now felt charged and claustrophobic. We are not talking about the furniture again, she said, her voice dangerously calm. I did what I thought was best. I was trying to save you from turning into a sad, old woman living in a shrine to the past. And what am I now? In your eyes? I demanded. A happy, well-adjusted woman? Frankly, you look like you've joined a cult, she said, gesturing vaguely at my slightly crooked pottery bowl on the counter. You're living in a tourist trap, working a dead-end job in a dusty bookstore, and hiding from your family. This isn't a life, Mom. It's an escape. And it's over. I've booked you a flight back to Boston for tomorrow afternoon. We can be home in time for dinner. She said it with such finality, as if my compliance was a foregone conclusion, as if the last 2 months of my life, the life I had so carefully and painstakingly built for myself, were nothing more than a childish tantrum that it was time to put an end to. I looked at my daughter, this successful, brilliant, and completely clueless woman. I saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear that had motivated her from the beginning. But I couldn't let her fear dictate my life anymore. I am not going anywhere. Jessica. Don't be ridiculous. Your lease here must be almost up anyway. I'm renewing it. I lied. The thought had only just occurred to me, but as I said it, felt like the truest thing in the world. Jessica stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. She was losing control, and she didn't know how to handle it. You can't be serious. I have never been more serious in my life, I said, my voice steady now. This is my home. These are my friends. This is my life. You don't have to understand it. You don't even have to like it. But you will respect it. Our standoff was interrupted by a cheerful voice from the doorway. Ellie? I brought you some tomatoes from my garden. They're finally ripe. It was Maria, holding a basket overflowing with red and yellow tomatoes. She stopped short when she saw Jessica, her smile faltering as she took in the tense atmosphere. Oh, I'm sorry. You have company, she said. Maria, this is my daughter, Jessica, I said, my voice tight. Jessica, this is my friend and neighbor, Maria. Jessica gave Maria a curt, dismissive nod, her eyes scanning Maria's paint-splattered jeans with disdain. Maria, unfazed, gave Jessica a broad, friendly smile. Jessica, so nice to finally meet you. Your mom talks about you all the time. Maria stepped inside and put the basket on the counter. Well, I'll let you two catch up. Ellie, we're still on for pottery tomorrow, right? Yes, course, I said, grateful for the interruption. After Maria left, Jessica turned to me, her eyes flashing. So that's your new life? Trading gossip with the local eccentric? Her name is Maria, I said through gritted teeth. And she is a better friend to me in 2 months than many people have been in a lifetime. She sees me, which is more than I can say for you right now. That's when her composure finally broke. Her face crumpled, the corporate mask falling away to reveal the terrified daughter underneath. I see you, she cried, her voice cracking. That's all I've been doing. I see you getting older. I see you being alone. I see you turning into grandma. After Grandpa died, she just disappeared. She sat in that house with all his old things and she just faded. She was there, but she was gone. I would talk to her and she wouldn't even hear me. I watched my mother lose her mother, and I swore I would not lose mine the same way. Tears were streaming down her face now. I sold the furniture because I thought if I could just get rid of the ghosts, I could keep you here with me. I didn't want to lose you. Mom, I don't want to lose you now. The confession hung in the air between us, raw and painful. It wasn't an excuse. It didn't make what she did right. But for the first time, I understood the desperation that fueled it. It wasn't about control. Not really. It was about love. Frantic, misguided, Suffocating love. But it was love. Before I could respond, the sky outside, which had been growing darker all morning, opened up. Sudden, violent clap of thunder shook the little cottage, and the rain began to fall in solid, blinding sheets. The wind howled, rattling the windows in their frames. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out, plunging the room into a deep, stormy gloom. The sudden darkness was absolute. For a moment, neither of us moved or spoke. The only sounds the roar of the wind and the furious drumming of rain on the tin roof. It was as if the storm outside had brought our own internal tempest to a crashing halt. The power of it was immense, dwarfing our small, human conflict. "It's just a summer squall," I said, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet of the house. "They pass quickly." But as I looked out the window, I knew this was more than a squall. The sky was a bruised, churning purple-gray. The oak trees were bent nearly double, their branches lashing wildly. This was a real storm, the kind the old-timers on the island probably had a name for. Jessica, who had always been terrified of thunderstorms, let out a small, shaky breath. In the dim light filtering through the windows, I could see her silhouette, rigid and tense. The confident executive was gone, replaced by the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during storms, her small body trembling. "We need candles," I said, my voice taking on a practical, calm tone that surprised even me. My initial shock and anger had been washed away by the storm's arrival, replaced by a primal instinct to create light and safety. I navigated the now unfamiliar darkness of my own home, my hands skimming over walls and furniture. I found a box of emergency candles and a book of matches in a kitchen drawer. I lit one, and the small, flickering flame pushed back the gloom, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. It was a tiny beacon of defiance against the raging storm. I lit a few more and placed them around the small living room. The candlelight softened the space, making it feel less like a battleground and more like a sanctuary. Jessica was still standing in the middle of the room, looking lost. "Come and sit down," I said gently, patting the striped sofa. "There's nothing to do now but wait it out." She moved slowly, hesitantly, and sat on the far end of the sofa, wrapping her arms around herself. We sat in silence for a long time, listening to the symphony of the storm. The wind shrieked, a sound like something in pain. Rain hammered against the windows, driven by a force that felt personal. Every now and then, a brilliant flash of lightning would illuminate the room in a stark, blue-white light, followed a second later by a deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the cottage to its foundations. With each clap, Jessica flinched. "It's okay," I found myself saying, the old maternal words coming easily to my lips. "We're safe in here." The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it was getting worse. I could hear the powerful crash of waves from the beach, a sound that was usually soothing but now sounded angry and threatening. "We used to do this, remember?" I said into the darkness, my voice soft. "When you were little, we'd turn off all the lights during a storm, light a candle, and I'd tell you stories." Jessica didn't answer, but I saw her turn her head toward me in the flickering light. "You always wanted to hear the story about the clumsy squirrel who couldn't remember where he buried his acorns," I continued, a faint smile on my face. "Or the one about the magical paintbrush that could bring drawings to life." I didn't expect a response, but after a moment, her voice came out of the darkness, small and strained. "The paintbrush was my favorite." We fell silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. The hard, angry edge was gone, replaced by a shared memory, a fragile bridge across the chasm that had opened between us. "That armchair," I said, my voice barely above the storm's roar. "The one you got rid of. Do you know where we got it?" She shook her head, a barely perceptible movement in the gloom. We bought it the day after we brought you home from the hospital. You were so tiny. Richard was terrified he would break you. He said he needed a big, sturdy chair. A captain's chair. He called it. To hold you properly. He sat in that chair and held you for 3 straight hours that first night. Just staring at your face while you slept. He said it was the most important job he'd ever have. I paused. The memory so vivid I could almost smell the baby powder and see the look of awe on my husband's face. And the dining table. Your father and I saved up for a year to buy that. It was our first real piece of furniture. The day it was delivered, we felt like we had finally made it. Like we were real adults. With a real home. Your high chair was pulled up to that table. You flung mashed peas all over it. You carved your initials into one of the legs with a fork when you were 7 and thought we wouldn't notice. I chuckled softly. We noticed. I kept talking. My voice a low murmur against the backdrop of the storm. I told her the stories of the things she had discarded. The story of the chipped teacup from a trip to England. The story of the faded rug that we'd had a picnic on in the living room during a blizzard. The story of the bookshelves Richard built. And how he measured them to be exactly the right height for me to reach the top shelf. I wasn't accusing her. I was just telling her. I was giving back the pieces of our history that she had thrown away. Not as objects, but as stories. As memories. For the first time. She was a captive audience. There were no phones to check. No meetings to run to. No modern furniture to distract her. There was just the storm. The candlelight. And my voice. I talked for what felt like hours. I talked until my throat was hoarse. And for the first time, Jessica just listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. She just sat there in the dark, listening to the life she had so casually dismissed. When I finally fell silent, the only sound was the rain, which had softened from a roar to a steady, heavy drumming. The wind had died down. The worst of the storm had passed. In the quiet that followed, Jessica spoke. Her voice was thick with tears. I didn't know. She whispered. I just saw old stuff. I saw dust. I didn't see the stories. She finally turned to look at me, her face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. It was a mess of tear tracks and regret. I'm so sorry. Mom. I'm so sorry. The words were the ones I had longed to hear for months. But hearing them now, in this little cottage, in the aftermath of the storm, they didn't bring the surge of vindication I might have expected. They just brought a profound, aching sadness for all the misunderstanding, for the pain we had caused each other, born from a place of love. I know, I said. And I did. Finally. Truly did. I was so scared. She went on, the words tumbling out now. Every time I came to the apartment, it felt heavier, sadder, like the memories were weighing the whole place down. I thought if I could just let some light in, some air. I thought I was giving you a gift, a fresh start. I was so arrogant. I never stopped to think that maybe you didn't want one, that you were happy with the start you had. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I've been so awful. I bulldozed your life. I didn't listen. I'm so sorry. Without thinking, I moved across the sofa and put my arm around her. She leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder, just as she had when she was a little girl afraid of the thunder. I held my daughter as she cried, her tears soaking the shoulder of my shirt. We stayed like that for a long time. The two of us huddled together in the candlelight as the storm outside finally exhausted itself and moved on. We weren't a project manager and her difficult client. We weren't a rebellious mother and her controlling daughter. We were just a mother and a child, finding their way back to each other in the dark. The rain eventually stopped, till watery light began to filter through the windows as the clouds broke. The power was still out, but the world outside was quiet, washed clean by the storm. I knew that one conversation couldn't magically fix everything. The hurt was deep. the chasm wide. But for the first time, we were standing on the same side of it, looking at the damage together. The storm had broken something open in both of us, clearing away the anger and the pride, leaving only the raw, messy, and undeniable love that had been there all along. The morning after the storm was unnaturally bright and clean. The air smelled of wet earth, salt, and pine. Puddles like shards of mirror reflected a brilliant blue sky. It was as if the world had been scrubbed clean. Jessica and I woke up stiff and rumpled on the sofa, a handmade quilt pulled over us. Sometime during the night, we had both drifted off, the emotional exhaustion as potent as any sleeping pill. The power was still out, so I filled a kettle with water and set it to boil on the small gas stove. The silence between us was no longer tense or angry. It was a quiet, contemplative space. Jessica sat at the small kitchen table, her expensive silk blouse wrinkled, her perfect hair in disarray. She looked younger, more vulnerable than I had seen her in years. "I called the airline," she said, looking at her phone, which had miraculously retained a sliver of battery. "I canceled my flight." I just nodded, pouring hot water over tea bags in 2 mugs. I placed one in front of her. Our hands brushed as she took it, and she didn't pull away. "Thank you," she said softly. "I need to check the town," I said, sipping my tea. "And my friends. Storms like that can cause a lot of damage on the island." "I'll come with you," she offered immediately. We walked out into the drenched, sparkling world. The sandpiper cottage had weathered the storm well, with only a few downed branches in the yard. But as we walked toward the main street, we saw the storm's true power. A massive oak tree had fallen across a road, its roots torn from the earth like a gaping wound. Fences were down, and shingles were scattered across lawns. The town center was a hub of activity. People were emerging from their homes, checking on neighbors, and starting the cleanup. There was no panic, just a calm, communal sense of purpose. Someone had already brought out a chainsaw and was beginning to cut up the fallen oak. "Ellie, you're all right." Maria came hurrying toward us, her face etched with concern. Her yard was a mess of scattered pottery shards and broken wind chimes. "That was a nasty one. We lost the big branch off the magnolia tree." "We're fine," I assured her. "Just lost power. This is my daughter, Jessica." This time, Jessica didn't just nod. She extended her hand. "It's nice to see you again, Maria." Maria, ever perceptive, seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere between us. She gave Jessica a warm, genuine smile. "You, too. Your mom's a natural at the wheel. You know, you should see the bowl she made." We continued our walk and found Arthur sweeping broken glass from the front step of the book nook. One of his large display windows had been shattered. "Arthur, are you okay?" I asked, rushing to his side. "Just a bit of a mess, Eleanor," he said, though he looked tired and shaken. The wind must have thrown a branch right through it. Luckily, most of the books inside are dry. "We can help," Jessica said, stepping forward before I could. "Let me get that for you." She took the broom from a surprised Arthur and began sweeping the glass into a neat pile with an efficiency that was second nature to her. For the rest of the day, the 3 of us worked. Jessica, in her now ruined designer slacks, helped Arthur move books away from the broken window and boarded up with plywood from the hardware store. I made sandwiches and coffee for the neighbors who were clearing the fallen tree. I watched my daughter as she worked. She wasn't managing or delegating. She was just helping. She listened as Arthur told a story about a hurricane in the 90s. She laughed when Maria made a joke about the storm redecorating her garden. She was seeing my life, not as a quaint experiment, but as a real place, filled with real people who cared for each other. That evening, with the power still out, the whole neighborhood gathered in the park for an impromptu potluck. People brought whatever they had in their coolers and pantries. Someone had a guitar. And soon a gentle melody drifted through the twilight air. It was a celebration of resilience, a quiet testament to the strength of their community. Jessica and I sat on a picnic blanket, eating chili from paper bowls. She was quiet, just watching the scene around her. She watched as Arthur came over to sit with us for a while, his presence easy and familiar. She watched as Maria led a group of children in a sing-along. "They're good people," she said, her voice soft. "Your friends?" "Yes," I said. "They are." "I get it now," she said, looking at me. "Why you like it here?" She paused, then added, "You seem happy, Mom. I haven't seen you look this happy in a long time." It was true. Amidst the cleanup and the uncertainty, I was happy. I was tired and sore, but I was content. I was a part of something. I belonged. Jessica stayed for 3 more days. She didn't try to convince me to leave. Instead, she entered my world. She walked with me on the beach in the mornings, and I showed her how to spot the glint of sea glass in the wet sand. She came with me to Maria's studio and, with some coaxing, sat at the potter's wheel. Her first attempt was a comical, wobbly failure, and to my astonishment, she laughed. A real, unforced belly laugh. She helped me at the bookstore, carefully cataloging a box of new arrivals with a focus that was both impressive and a little terrifying. She and Arthur had a long conversation about business management, and I could see a newfound respect in her eyes for the quiet man who ran his small, beloved shop with such care. On her last night, we sat on the porch swing, the air finally cool and dry. The power had been restored, and the lights of the town twinkled around us. "I found something," she said, reaching into her pocket. She opened her palm, and lying in the center was a small, perfectly smooth, cornflower blue piece of sea glass. It was right at the water's edge this morning. "It's beautiful," I said. "A rare color." She closed her hand around it. "When I get back to Boston, I'm going to try and track down your things." I looked at her, surprised. "I don't know if it's possible," she continued, her gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "The company said most of it would be auctioned or sold. But I have the inventory list. I can try. I can try to find Richard's chair." The offer was a gift, more precious than any designer sofa. It was an acknowledgement of her mistake, an attempt at restitution. "Thank you, Jessica," I said, my voice thick. "That means a lot to me." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "But you don't have to. It's okay." She looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" I thought. "The stories, Jess. They aren't in the chair. They're in here," I said, tapping my chest. "You and the storm. You taught me that. I don't need the chair to remember my husband. I don't need the table to remember our family." The anchors were gone, but I hadn't drifted away. I had just found a new harbor. She seemed to understand. She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with tears. "I love you, Mom. I love you, too, sweetheart." The next morning, I drove her to the small regional airport an hour away. As we stood at the security gate, she gave me a fierce, tight hug. "You'll call?" she asked, her voice muffled in my shoulder. "Every week," I promised. "And you'll come visit? For Christmas? Maybe." "Maybe," I said, smiling. "We'll see." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. It was an open door. A new possibility in a relationship that had been built on locked doors and rigid expectations. I watched her walk through security, a small figure in a big, busy world. She turned one last time and waved, a real, genuine smile on her face. As I walked back to my car, I felt not a sense of loss, but of lightness. Our relationship hadn't been fixed. Not completely. It had been broken open by the storm. And now, like one of Maria's lopsided pots, we had the chance to piece it back together into something new. Something stronger, more honest, and far more beautiful in its imperfection. The autumn that followed Jessica's visit was the most beautiful I had ever experienced. In Boston, autumn was a frantic, final burst of glory before the long, gray siege of winter. Here in Seaglass Point, it was a gentle, golden letting go. The air grew crisp, the summer crowds thinned out, and the town settled into a comfortable, quiet rhythm. The ocean, too, seemed to change, its blues deepening, its waves carrying a more thoughtful, melancholic tune. My life continued on its new, simple path. I worked at the bookstore, spent afternoons in Maria's studio, and walked the beach. But something inside me had shifted. The desperate, defiant edge to my independence was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. I wasn't running from something anymore. I was living toward something. My friendship with Arthur deepened into a sweet, unspoken companionship. We'd often close the shop together, then walk down to the pier to watch the sunset, talking about our days. He was a good man, steady and kind. He saw me for who I was right now, but he also respected the long story that had come before. He never made me feel like my love for Richard was a ghost in the room. He made space for it, honored it. One cool November evening, as we stood on the pier watching the sky blaze orange and pink, he reached over and took my hand. His hand was warm and dry, his grip gentle but firm. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a surprising jolt of warmth through me. I didn't pull away. We just stood there, side by side, our fingers intertwined, watching the sun sink into the sea. It wasn't a wild, passionate flame. It was the quiet, steady glow of a shared ember, a promise of warmth against the coming winter. My weekly calls with Jessica were different now. She'd ask about my pottery, about Arthur, about the town gossip. She'd tell me about her work, but she'd also tell me about trying a new recipe, or a funny thing she saw in the park. We were learning to be friends. A week before Thanksgiving, a large package arrived at my door. It was from Jessica. I opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in layers of tissue paper, was a beautiful, handcrafted wooden box. It was made of dark, polished cherry wood, and the lid was inlaid with a simple, elegant design of a sandpiper. I lifted the lid. Inside was not a piece of modern decor or a gadget. It was a photo album. But it was more than that. The first page was a professionally restored photograph of my wedding day. Richard and I were so young. His smile so bright. My eyes so full of hope. I touched the image, half expecting to feel the warmth of that long ago day. I turned the pages. There were hundreds of photos, all meticulously restored and arranged in chronological order. Pictures I hadn't seen in years. Pictures I thought were lost forever in dusty boxes. There was Jessica as a baby, covered in spaghetti. Richard teaching her how to ride a bike. The three of us on the beach in Cape Cod, squinting into the sun. It was the book of my life, the one I thought had been erased. Underneath the album was a small, sleek tablet and a note in Jessica's familiar, sharp handwriting. Mom, I couldn't find the chair. I think it's gone for good. And like you said, maybe that's okay. But I realized that the stories weren't just in your head, they were in those faded, forgotten photo albums in the back of the closet, too. I had them all professionally scanned and restored. There are thousands of them on this tablet, all organized by year. I thought you might like to have them. I can't give you back your furniture, but I can give you this. A backup copy of our history. I booked a flight. I'll be there the day before Thanksgiving. That's okay. All my love. Jessica. Tears streamed down my face as I clutched the letter to my chest. She had listened. She had understood. She had found a way to honor the past while embracing the future. She hadn't tried to replace what was lost, but to preserve what was most important. This was her apology, her peace offering, her love, all contained in a cherrywood box. The day before Thanksgiving was bright and chilly. I drove to the airport, my heart light. When Jessica walked through the gate, she wasn't carrying a briefcase. She was carrying a small duffel bag and a pumpkin pie. We hugged. A real, warm hug, free of the tension that had defined our relationship for so long. "Is that Mrs. Higgins' recipe?" I asked, eyeing the pie. She laughed. "No. It's from a fancy bakery in Boston. I'm not that good yet." Thanksgiving was a quiet, perfect day. It was just me, Jessica, Arthur, and Maria, gathered around the small table in my cottage. We ate turkey and stuffing, and 2 kinds of pie. We talked and laughed. There were no ghosts at our table, only fond memories. Jessica told a funny story about Richard trying to assemble her tricycle on Christmas Eve, and we all laughed until we cried. It was a new kind of family, cobbled together from the broken pieces of our old lives, made stronger in the mending. Later that afternoon, Jessica and I walked on the beach. The air was cold, and we zipped our jackets up to our chins. The ocean was a deep, dilly gray, calm and vast. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said, breaking a comfortable silence. "I'm proud of you, too," I answered honestly. We walked on, our shoulders occasionally brushing. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the piece of blue sea glass she had found months ago. She held it out to me. "I want you to have this," she said. I looked at the small, perfect jewel in her palm. "No," I said softly. "You keep it. To remind you." She closed her fingers around it and nodded, understanding. I looked out at the horizon, at the endless expanse of water and sky. A year ago, I had lost my home. I had lost my past. I felt like a piece of broken glass, sharp-edged and worthless, tossed into the churning sea. But the ocean and the tides of time had done their work. They had smoothed my edges, softened my pain, and washed me ashore in a place I had never expected. I wasn't a broken thing anymore. I was something new, something whole. I reached into my own pocket, my fingers finding the familiar, smooth shape of a piece of sea glass I had picked up that morning. I was still Eleanor Vance, Richard's widow and Jessica's mother. But I was also Eleanor, the friend, the potter, the bookseller, the woman who lived by the sea. I was the keeper of my own stories now, and I knew, with a certainty that was as deep and calm as the ocean in front of me, that the best ones were still waiting to be written.